The Luzon Strait, at 7:18 a.m., was 250 kilometers wide and carrying a political charge that no other passage in the Indo-Pacific matched at this particular moment. The strait ran north to south between Taiwan's southern tip and the Philippine island of Luzon, waters through which the U.S. Navy exercised freedom of navigation rights that China contested through its 9-dash line, asserting that any foreign military transit required Chinese permission. The United States, the Philippines, and Japan had each rejected this position through separate legal and diplomatic channels. The Chinese assertion was persistent and operationally expressed. The Luzon Strait at 7:18 a.m. was where that gap would be managed simultaneously in 3 languages on 3 coordination circuits with 3 sets of national rules of engagement. The U.S. destroyer was the transit vessel. It had entered the strait from the Pacific at 0530 and was proceeding southwest at 14 knots. The Philippine Navy corvette, a Jacinto-class patrol vessel based at Cavite, was 11 nautical miles to the south, escorting a commercial tanker transiting from Taiwan toward Manila. The JMSDF destroyer, operating under a bilateral information-sharing framework that Japan had established for Luzon Strait operations following a 2023 coordination agreement, was 18 nautical miles to the north, tracking its own contact picture on a transit back toward Japanese waters after a scheduled port call in Manila. 3 national vessels, 3 command chains, 3 sets of rules of engagement. At 7:18 a.m., 3 contacts changed their behavior simultaneously. The contact picture had been standard Luzon Strait traffic for the preceding 4 hours. The 2 Chinese vessels that had been logged since 0200 as planned warships in a patrol disposition northwest of the Strait's center line, and the CCG cutter that had appeared at 0615 on the eastern edge of the Strait's northern approaches. The planned contacts were Type 05 2D Luoyang 3-class destroyers, 7,500 tons each, equipped with the HHQ-9 surface-to-air system and YJ-18 anti-ship cruise system cells. Large platforms, capable platforms. Platforms that had been in a patrol position since 0200 and that the CIC had assessed through the overnight watch as standard area familiarization patrol, no action indicated. At 7:18 a.m., both planned contacts altered course simultaneously. Course change, southward. Speed increase from 8 knots to 18 knots. Simultaneously, the CCG cutter to the north began moving south on a track that the CIC tactical officer projected would bring it to the center of the strait in approximately 20 minutes. 3 contacts, coordinated movement toward the destroyer's transit track. Bridge, CIC. Contact formation alteration. Planned contact Alpha, bearing 312, range 11.4 nautical miles, now course 178, speed 18 knots. Planned contact Bravo, bearing 285, range 14.1 nautical miles, now course 163, speed 17 knots. CCG contact Sierra, bearing 336, range 16.8 nautical miles, course 184, speed 14 knots. Formation geometry is converging on the Strait centerline. CPA estimates: Alpha, 600 yards. Bravo, 800 yards. Sierra, 1,200 yards. Time to convergence at centerline approximately 19 minutes, 600 yards. 800 yards, 1,200 yards. 3 contacts, 3 CPAs, 19 minutes. The officer of the deck was at the radar display. He was also watching 2 additional data streams that had not been present in any prior gray zone encounter he had studied. The Philippine Navy corvette's AIS track to the south, which had changed its behavior at 7:19 a.m. to show a speed increase to 16 knots. The Philippine commanding officer had seen the same formation alteration and was moving. And the JMSDF destroyer's position update, which at 7:20 a.m. showed a course change to the southwest. The Japanese commanding officer was also repositioning. 3 national vessels responding to the same picture simultaneously without having coordinated their responses with each other. He pressed the intercom. At 7:20 a.m., the captain stepped onto the bridge. He looked at the contact picture for 20 seconds. 3 Plan/CCG contacts converging on the Strait centerline. 2 Allied vessels repositioning from the south and north, 19 minutes to the convergence point. He noted the geometry. The planned contacts were approaching from the northwest and west, not from ahead of the destroyer's track. The formation was not blocking the transit. It was flanking it, a different geometry from the boxing maneuver, a different geometry from the Taiwan Strait 3 vessel box, a different geometry from anything in the encounter record he had reviewed. The flanking approach placed Chinese vessels to the destroyer's port and port quarter, while the CCG vessel came in from the northwest, a formation that would surround the destroyer on 3 sides, leaving the southern transit lane open, with all 3 contacts documenting from different angles simultaneously. Flanking, not blocking. The flanking formation created a specific narrative. The U.S. destroyer, transiting through a corridor flanked by Chinese naval and Coast Guard vessels, which could be photographed from 3 separate angles and presented as evidence that the transit had occurred under Chinese supervision. That was the objective, not to stop the transit, to own the narrative of the transit. He turned to the officer of the deck. "I have the con." He looked at the radar display and then at the coordination circuits. The 3-way coordination was the challenge that was different from every prior encounter. In the Taiwan Strait, the issue had been the destroyer alone against planned contacts. In the Senkaku encounter, the MSDF had been present but on a separate tactical circuit with a communication lag. In the Luzon Strait at 7:20 a.m., there were 2 Allied vessels whose commanding officers had already begun acting on their own tactical assessments, who had different national rules of engagement, different communication protocols, and different national interests in how this encounter was framed and documented. The Philippine commanding officer would be looking at 3 Chinese contacts converging on a U.S. destroyer in waters his government claimed under the 2016 PCA ruling, and his response calculus would include elements the U.S. commanders did not. The JMSDF commanding officer operated under Japan's self-defense framework, which permitted coordination with the U.S. Navy but had specific constraints on responses to third-party provocations. 3 commanding officers, 3 rule sets, 19 minutes. CPA to Alpha, 580 yards. Time 17 minutes. At 7:22 a.m., the captain opened the 3-way tactical coordination circuit. "All stations, this is U.S. destroyer. Plan formation, Alpha, Bravo, and CCG Sierra converging on straight centerline. Formation consistent with flanking documentation maneuver, not blocking. My assessment, the objective is narrative, not interdiction. My plan, maintain transit course, fire control radar on both planned contacts, Seahawk launch for altitude documentation, request both Allied vessels hold their current positions and maintain documentation posture. Do not approach the Chinese formation. Do not alter toward the Chinese contacts. The narrative we want is 3 nations transiting the Luzon Strait simultaneously and documenting the encounter, not 1 nation being assisted by 2 others. Hold your positions and document. Respond." The Philippine corvette responded first in English. "U.S. destroyer, Philippines Navy concurs. We are holding position and will maintain documentation on the formation from the south. We are activating our own aerial surveillance asset, coastal surveillance aircraft from Clark, ETA 18 minutes. This is Philippine waters. We will document. 18 minutes for the Philippine aerial asset." The convergence was 19 minutes away. The timing was close. The JMSDF destroyer responded 22 seconds later. "U.S. destroyer, Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force concurs. Holding position north-northwest, fire control tracking active on the formation, transmitting picture to JMSDF Pacific Command and 7th Fleet." 3 confirmations. All 3 vessels would hold position and document. The formation approach would be flanked, in the opposite direction from what China had intended, by a U.S. destroyer maintaining transit, a Philippine Navy vessel to the south, and a JMSDF destroyer to the north. 3 nations encounter records. 3 nations aerial and radar documentation. 3 nations independent accounts of the same event. At 7:23 a.m., the fire control radar entered active tracking mode on contact Alpha. CPA to Alpha, 550 yards. Time, 15 minutes. At 7:23 a.m., the first friction event arrived on the coordination circuit. The Philippine corvette's commanding officer transmitted a second message, this one carrying a different kind of content. U.S. destroyer, Philippines Navy. We are receiving a Channel 16 broadcast from CCG Sierra in Mandarin and English. Broadcasting claims these are Chinese sovereign waters, and all foreign military vessels require Chinese authorization for transit. Broadcast is claiming the Chinese formation is conducting authorized patrol of Chinese territorial waters. We are logging it. This is Philippine Exclusive Economic Zone and Philippine territorial waters under UNCLOS. We will respond on Channel 16 from Philippine Navy in Filipino and English. The Philippine commanding officer was going to respond on Channel 16 in Filipino. That was his operational decision under his national authority in waters his government claimed. It was also a complication. A Channel 16 broadcast in Filipino from a Philippine Navy vessel responding to a Chinese sovereignty claim in the Luzon Strait with a U.S. destroyer on transit, while 3 Chinese contacts were 19 minutes from convergence, was a layered communication event that would be received and assessed by everyone monitoring Channel 16 in the Western Pacific simultaneously. The captain acknowledged, "Philippines Navy understood. Your response is your national authority. Coordinate with us on timing if possible. Recommend you broadcast after our fire control notification to ensure sequence is clear in the record. Philippines Navy understood. We'll coordinate timing." The JMSDF destroyer had been listening. Its commanding officer transmitted, "U.S. destroyer, Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force. We will transmit the complete CCG Sierra Sovereignty broadcast transcript to Japanese Ministry of Defense and to Japanese Embassy Manila for diplomatic record. We will not respond on Channel 16. Our national guidance does not authorize Channel 16 response to third-party sovereignty claims in this context. We note this for the record." 3 different responses to the same Channel 16 broadcast from the same Chinese vessel. The U.S. would conduct fire control notification. The Philippines would respond on Channel 16 in Filipino and English. Japan would transmit the transcript to diplomatic channels and remain silent on Channel 16. All 3 responses were legitimate under their respective national frameworks. All 3 were happening simultaneously. The encounter record was being built in 3 languages by 3 governments at once. CPA to Alpha, 500 yards. Time 13 minutes. At 7:25 a.m., the Seahawk launched. Its role was documentation from altitude. The 3-nation encounter, the formation approach, the Allied vessels' positions, and the specific aerial perspective on the geometry that no ship-mounted camera could provide. At 400 feet, the Seahawk's camera would show the full contact picture. 3 Chinese vessels approaching from the northwest and west, a U.S. destroyer on transit course, a Philippine Navy corvette to the south, a JMSDF destroyer to the north, all 6 vessels in a single frame that would constitute the encounter's defining visual document. The Seahawk climbed to 400 feet and established its orbit. At 7:26 a.m., the captain transmitted on Channel 16 in English. Chinese naval and Coast Guard vessels approaching from the northwest and west. This is a United States warship conducting a lawful freedom of navigation transit in the Luzon Strait. This transit is conducted in international waters under UNCLOS. The 2 planned destroyers are currently inside fire control radar tracking from our vessel. This transit is being documented jointly by United States, Republic of the Philippines, and Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force assets. The full encounter record is being transmitted in real time to 7th Fleet Command, Philippine Naval Command, and Japan Maritime Self-Defense Force Pacific Command. You are advised to maintain safe distances from this vessel and from all Allied vessels in the area. 3 nations named. 3 command chains receiving the record. 3 sets of documentation assets in the Strait simultaneously. The Channel 16 broadcast was a specific counter-narrative to the CCG Sierra's sovereignty claim. Not just, "We are transiting lawfully," but "We are transiting lawfully in front of 3 witnesses." The Philippine corvette transmitted on Channel 16 30 seconds later in Filipino and then English, referencing the 2016 PCA ruling naming the Luzon Strait as Philippine waters under UNCLOS, stating that Philippine Navy vessels were operating under national legal authority and were observing the encounter. 90 seconds. Neither planned contact responded on Channel 16. CCG Sierra repeated its sovereignty broadcast. CPA to Alpha, 450 yards. Time 12 minutes. At 7:27 a.m., the second friction event arrived. The three-way tactical coordination circuit produced a 22-second silence that, in the context of a 12-minute countdown, was not silence, but the specific gap between the Philippine corvette completing its Channel 16 broadcast and the JMSDF destroyer, acknowledging on the coordination circuit. The gap was caused by the Japanese commanding officer's requirement to receive confirmation from JMSDF Pacific Command before transmitting on the tactical circuit anything that went beyond his pre-authorized response parameters. The confirmation arrived. The acknowledgement was transmitted. The 22 seconds had been managed without incident, but they had been 22 seconds in which the tactical picture was developing and the three-way coordination was briefly interrupted. The captain noted it. He did not address it on the circuit. The interruption was a documentation artifact, not a tactical failure. The JMSDF commanding officer had operated correctly within his framework. The 22 seconds were now in the encounter record as a coordination gap that had been managed. CPA to Alpha, 430 yards. Time, 11 minutes. The CIWS completed its power on at 7:28 a.m. and entered passive thermal tracking mode on contact Alpha. The barrel oriented toward the planned Type 052D and followed its bearing as the contact moved. At 7:29 a.m., the Philippine Coastal Surveillance Aircraft, a Cessna C-208 maritime patrol aircraft from Clark Air Base, established contact on the Philippine Navy coordination frequency. It was at 3,500 feet altitude, 22 nautical miles south-southwest, inbound. ETA to the Strait centerline area, 9 minutes. Earlier than the 18-minute estimate, the aircraft had accelerated its approach from Clark. A surveillance aircraft at 3,500 feet with a camera optimized for surface vessels, arriving in 9 minutes, would provide an aerial documentation perspective from the south that complemented the Seahawk's perspective from the U.S. destroyer's position. The encounter would have 2 aerial documentation assets and 3 surface documentation assets. CPA to Alpha, 400 yards. Time, 10 minutes. The captain stood at the center bridge window. He was watching the formation approach on the radar display and through the bridge windows. Both planned contacts now visible at 7.5 nautical miles as gray hull shapes against the Pacific blue. Large warships at 18 knots with their bow waves visible at this range. To the south, invisible at 11 nautical miles, was the Philippine corvette holding its position, its commanding officer having just delivered a 90-second Channel 16 statement that would appear in every monitoring station's log in the Western Pacific. To the north, invisible at 18 nautical miles, was the JMSDF destroyer with fire control tracking active on the formation and a direct uplink to JMSDF Pacific Command running. 3 nations, 3 records, 3 sets of eyes on the same formation. The Chinese formation's objective was documentation of Chinese supervision. The counter-documentation was already built, 3 nations' records transmitted in real time to 3 national command chains. The flanking formation would generate footage of a U.S. destroyer transiting in international waters with 2 Allied vessels and 2 aerial documentation assets recording simultaneously. CPA to Alpha, 350 yards. Time, 9 minutes. The tail appeared at 7:32 a.m. Planned contact Bravo. The western contact, which had been at 17 knots on course 163, adjusted course 2 degrees south. The CPA projection for Bravo, which had been holding at 800 yards, began to open. 820 yards, then 840. The course change was small. It was visible across 3 radar sweeps. The tactical officer confirmed it at the 3rd sweep. Contact Bravo has adjusted course. 2 degrees south. CPA now opening, projecting 860 yards. 2 degrees. Bravo was not withdrawing. It was adjusting. But the adjustment was in the direction of more distance, not less, and it was timed exactly at the moment when the Philippine aircraft's ETA had been confirmed on the coordination circuit, the moment at which the documentation asset count for the encounter had reached 3 aerial and 3 surface platforms, all recording, all transmitting in real time. The blink came in 3 layers. On the radar display, Bravo's CPA continuing to open, 880 yards, 900, over successive sweeps. Then Alpha, a 1-knot speed reduction from 18 knots to 17, visible in the bearing update rate. 1 knot, barely measurable, but the rate of Alpha's approach had slowed. Then CCG Sierra, the sovereignty broadcast on Channel 16, ceased. Not a new broadcast, the repeated sovereignty claim that had been cycling every 4 minutes stopped cycling. The frequency that had been carrying the CCG's prepared statement was empty. The captain noted each layer. He said nothing. The formation was still closing. Alpha was at 330 yards. But Bravo was opening. Alpha was at 17 knots, not 18. The CCG broadcast was silent. The 3-layer blink was not dramatic. It was the specific quiet recalibration of a formation that had encountered a documentation environment it had not fully accounted for. At 7:34 a.m., the Philippine coastal surveillance aircraft arrived over the strait and established its documentation orbit at 3,500 feet. The Philippine pilots check in on the coordination circuit in English. Philippines Navy, surveillance aircraft on station, 3,500 feet straight centerline area. I have all contacts visual and on camera. Recording. All contacts visual. Recording. The 6th documentation asset in the encounter was now operational. Alpha reached its CPA at 7:35 a.m., 330 yards. The original estimate had been 600 yards. The formation had closed further than projected, but 330 yards with 2 Allied vessels holding, fire control radar tracking, and 2 aerial documentation assets recording was not the geometry the formation had intended. Plan Bravo CPA, 920 yards, opening. CCG Sierra, 1,400 yards, held north of the straight centerline. At 7:38 a.m., fire control radar to standby. CIWS to passive surveillance. The Seahawk continued its documentation orbit for 15 additional minutes before recovery. The Philippine aircraft maintained its orbit for 20 minutes, its camera recording the withdrawal of the formation to the northwest, then returned to Clark. At 7:39 a.m., Channel 16 from Alpha. In English, United States warship, the People's Republic of China notes your unauthorized transit of Chinese sovereign waters. Your activity has been documented by People's Liberation Army Navy assets. China reserves the right to respond through appropriate channels. Your activity has been documented. The Chinese formation had come to document. It had documented. And it had just transmitted on Channel 16 its own version of the encounter record, which would sit alongside the U.S. destroyer's encounter report, the Philippine Navy's encounter log, the JMSDF's documentation package, the Seahawks footage archive, and the Philippine aircraft surveillance camera record. 6 documentation sets. 6 perspectives on the same event. 5 of them showed an international transit corridor in which 3 allied nations had documented the encounter jointly, each in their own national record, each transmitted in real time to their own command chains. The 6th showed what China wanted the record to show. The captain did not respond on Channel 16. No one on the bridge spoke for a long moment. The helmsman was 24 years old. He had held the transit course southwest through the entire encounter, through the formation approach, through the Channel 16 broadcasts in 3 languages, through the 22-second coordination gap on the tactical circuit, through the TEL and the blink and the CPA of 330 yards from a Type 052D destroyer. His standing order was the transit course. His hands were at 10 and 2. The Luzon Strait was the Luzon Strait. The transit course was the transit course. The officer of the deck looked at the radar display. Alpha at 620 yards and opening north. Bravo at 1,100 yards and opening west. Sierra at 1,600 yards, stationary, north of the center line. The Philippine corvette to the south on its original position, resuming its escort of the commercial tanker toward Manila. The JMSDF destroyer to the north, back on its original track toward Japanese waters. He straightened his collar. The encounter had taken 41 minutes. 6 documentation assets. 3 Channel 16 broadcasts in 3 languages, 1 22-second coordination gap, 3 Allied nations records of the same 41 minutes. The captain walked to the chart table. The encounter report would go to 7th Fleet Indo-Pacific Command, the U.S. Embassy Manila, the U.S. Embassy Tokyo, and the State Department Asia Bureau. The JMSDF's documentation package would go through Japanese national channels and be cross-referenced with the U.S. report. The Philippines encounter log would be filed with Philippine Naval Command and the Bilateral Defense Treaty Mechanism. 3 encounter reports, 3 national archives, 1 event. Full encounter report to 7th Fleet and Indo-PACOM include the complete 3-nation coordination circuit transcript, the Seahawk footage archive, the Philippine aerial surveillance contact record, the fire control radar activation log, and all Channel 16 transcripts, including the CCG Sierra Sovereignty broadcast and Alpha's closing transmission. He paused. Coordinate with Philippine and JMSDF commands on joint documentation package for Indo-PACOM's strategic record. This encounter is the format for how Luzon Strait transits should work when the formation shows up. He looked at the chart. The transit corridor continued southwest toward the South China Sea. Continue the transit. Good watch. The record assembled here speaks in the language the ocean keeps. 2 planned Type 052D destroyers and 1 CCG cutter executed a coordinated flanking formation approach against a U.S. destroyer, transiting the Luzon Strait at 7:18 a.m. The formation's objective was documented supervision of a U.S. military transit through Chinese-claimed waters. The formation did not block the transit. It sought to own the narrative of the transit. Documentation assets present at time of Alpha CPA, U.S. destroyer, fire control radar, CIWS passive tracking, U.S. Seahawk at 400 feet, Philippine coastal surveillance aircraft at 3,500 feet, Philippine Navy corvette surface documentation at 11 nautical miles south, JMSDF destroyer surface and radar documentation at 18 nautical miles north. Total, 6 independent documentation assets, 3 national records. Alpha CPA, 330 yards. Bravo CPA, 920 yards. Sierra CPA, 1,400 yards, held north of Strait Centerline. Channel 16 broadcasts CCG Sierra Sovereignty Claim, repeated. U.S. Destroyer 3-Nation Documentation Notification, Philippine Navy National Response in Filipino and English, Alpha Closing Transmission. U.S. Destroyer Response to Alpha Closing, 0. 3-Nation Tactical Coordination Circuit, U.S. Philippines, JMSDF. Communication gap logged, 22 seconds, JMSDF confirmation delay. All 3 nations held their positions without approaching Chinese formation. Tell. Plan Bravo. 2-degree course change at 7:32 a.m. CPA, opening from 800 to 920 yards. Alpha speed reduction 1 knot at 7:33 a.m. CCG Sierra Sovereignty broadcast ceased at 7:33 a.m. Philippine aircraft arrival at 7:34 a.m. correlated with tell timing. Fire control radar activated on both planned contacts. Yes. CIWS passive tracking. Yes. Weapons authorized. No. Weapons released. No. Transit course maintained throughout. Yes. Operation continued. Yes. The Luzon Strait runs between 2 countries that both dispute Chinese sovereignty claims over the water between them. 3 nations documenting the same 41 minutes does not change the water. It changes what the record says about who was in it.